Yo, what's up? It's someone that's someone, and welcome back to another story mix. Today, as requested, we got a mix on unknown substances, mystery substances. That is, someone who took a substance where either they don't know or we don't know what it is. And by we don't know, I mean when the writer's being vague and did something else in combination. But these days, this can happen by chance quite a lot actually. Most of the time, we have a general idea of what it's supposed to be, but things can be cut, and sometimes an entirely different substance. I think the most common cases come with acid and then pills, whether that be M-bomb or something like fentanyl. And today's reports aren't exactly that, but they're unknown substances nonetheless. And before we get into this, I do want to know, many of these are taken from various points in time, so the quality will vary. Besides that, let me know what you guys want to see next. If you want to see more of these, hit the like button and subscribe. It's been someone that's someone. Without further ado, let's dive right into this. I'm still not entirely sure what it was. I don't regularly take pills. It's not something I really enjoy, and I rarely have them anyway. But a little while ago, a friend of mine gave me a line or two of some pill. She's a great friend. Lots of experience when it comes to drugs, so I figured it was probably a Percocet or something and snorted it. It was around 5 p.m. After a little while, I started to feel dizzy and heavy, like most drugs do to me, but it wasn't noticeably affecting my mood. It wasn't high. It felt more like being drunk. I tried to run for a few feet and just about fell on my face. It was somewhat pleasant, nonetheless. I didn't notice the cold weather hardly as much as I did before I took it. At around 5:30, my buddies took me home and left. I took about 4 to 6 Benadryls. I really don't remember how many I took. It was around 150 milligrams of Diphenhydramine. At around 6:30-ish, the Benadryl was kicking in pretty well. I was really drowsy and I just felt heavy all around. The weird things I was seeing because of the Benadryl wasn't helping too much either. Everything was twitching and I kept imagining people walking around my house. But it didn't bug me too much because I am very familiar with the effects of Diphenhydramine. I decided to lie down for a few minutes and that's all I remember happening. I passed out, I guess. It wasn't any later than 7. I woke up at around 5 or 6 in the morning, completely clueless to my surroundings, of course. It only took me a few minutes to figure out that I had fallen asleep and had been in the same spot for the past 10 hours. I hadn't even taken anything off before I lied down. I was completely dressed, sans boots. All the windows on my computer were the same, and I didn't even turn my lights off before I fell asleep. It was whatever, I thought. I just fell asleep. Got ready and went to school as usual when I found out one of my other friends who had done the same pill just earlier in the day, she took hers around 9 a.m., had been in the emergency room all yesterday and was still in the hospital for an overdose. I don't know how many she took. It was probably 2 or 3. As it turns out, the friend that gave me the line didn't even know what it was. She was under the impression it was Valium or Percocet. When I told her that I passed out and had no clue what was going on, she flipped and told me to take it easy. I was talking to an acquaintance of mine the other day about the experience. I described the pill to him. It was a yellow/orange color and had an ellipse. He told me it was probably Xanax. I don't know though. I've never heard of Xanax hospitalizing anyone. I definitely didn't expect any of that to happen. All I expected was maybe a buzz, like a mild high. Turns out this shit sent a friend of mine into the hospital. I have no clue what happened to her after that. I asked her boyfriend, and he didn't know either. And it made me conk out for a good 10 hours. All I suggest to people is, don't take anything unless you are 100% aware of what it is. Smoking bunk weed. This was a completely spontaneous experience with some good friends. I'll describe some of the events leading up to the experience as I think they affected the outcome. It was the end of term course ball, a formal along the lines of a prom. At around 7, myself and a flatmate, a good friend I'll call Amir, along with his girlfriend, headed out of our student accommodation to the hotel where the event was being hosted. The evening wasn't particularly notable. I was in good company, but due to nerves and my own anxiety, It wasn't very enjoyable, so I hit up some other friends who did a different course and weren't at the event. I met them in a town near the hotel. They are a couple, two girls I'll call Taya and Noelle, and one of them also lived in my student accommodation. So we headed back there with the intention of celebrating the end of term with a few joints. Getting the weed proved difficult as Noelle hadn't picked up any like she usually did, so we find another guy in the accommodation, someone I'll call Cody, who we're all friends with but not super close to. He tells us he's got us, but he needs the cash. We head to town to take out cash, and he tells us to wait outside some shop while he goes to meet the dealer. Apparently, the guy would be spooked if we all turned up, so he left us behind to go pick up. We all then head back. I'm quite anxious as this is my first time actually buying. I've always been a good boy, but it ends up being pretty chill. We smoke in Cody's flat as he had already covered the smoke alarm. He rolls 2 joints and the 2 girls and I smoke first. The girls say they've had enough and Noelle complains of a weird taste, but I wasn't tasting it, so I go for the second joint. I'm not able to finish it as it starts to get a bit intense, so I just put it out. Noelle collects the rest of the weed. This all happened at about 12:30 a.m. We head back to Taya's flat at the student accommodation and sit down in her kitchen. I'm feeling a bit spaced out with a fairly heavy body high. I'm a little nauseous, but that's nothing weird considering how much I smoked. This is where it all goes to shit. All of a sudden, I looked up at Noelle as we were talking, and her eyes are gone, replaced with thick, black zigzags. I freaked out as this was the first time I've ever properly hallucinated. My memory kinda went to shit, so the chronology might be a bit off from this point onwards, but I'll try my best. This was the end of the come-up, but I was nowhere near the peak. The room started to darken around the edges, and everything began to vibrate. It's difficult to describe, but it was like a strobe light or something, with everything vibrating at like 20 to 30 hertz. It was kind of like an old TV with the cable not fully connected. The shadows thrown by the curtains become little tornadoes, and by this point, my heart is beating out of my chest, so Taya tries to comfort me. We're sitting at the kitchen table, and she's trying to talk me down, but it's not working at all. I'm on the edge of what I now know to be ego death, and I was clutching the table because in my mind, if I let go, I would lose my mind. I'm fucking terrified at this point. Some time passes with me feeling like I'm fading in and out of reality, and I start to have closed-eye visuals with thoughts flashing through my mind at 1,000,000 miles per hour. Me in a hospital bed, my parents crying, the grave, the ambulance, the flashing lights, the hospital, in an endless, horrible loop. At this point, I'm having a panic attack too. I move to the sofa, and Noelle, who had been showering, comes back through. Her spots were moving around her face, which was weird, but amused me and helped me calm down a little. She wasn't as hot after taking off all the makeup. She gave me a hug, and I remember vividly the smell of the shampoo. It really helped me ground myself in reality. I've since learned that smells seem to do that more than other stimuli. Around 1.5 hours in, my panic continues and I start to have some very weird hallucinations. I think my skin is peeling off like clay and I try to grab it. My mouth disappears and I think, oh shit, how can I speak? My whole body is shaking like fuck. Ego death, I should note, seems to have been averted, perhaps a mistake. Various other intense semi-tactile hallucinations occur and my friends are starting to be like, what the fuck is wrong with him? My flatmate Amir and his girlfriend come home. This is also his girlfriend's flat, and he helps me calm down. Everyone's feeding me water, and I try to speak, but I can't put together a sentence. I could only get about 4 words out before suddenly forgetting what's going on and what I was about to say. This continues for a while as I start to finally come down. The time is around 3 a.m., and by this point, another friend, Barry, has appeared and takes me back to my flat where we chill in the kitchen. I go and relieve myself. A very strange experience in itself, as I seem to have extra feelings, but too much information. I go to sleep, hoping this hasn't fucked me for life, and wake up 7 to 8 hours later, feeling not too bad. after effects. Though I initially felt okay, this experience has really haunted me and caused, among other things, serious long-term effects such as depersonalization and derealization, as well as a massive increase of my general anxiety. This kind of PTSD effect is so much that just typing this out has sent my heart racing. It was probably the most unpleasant 2 hours of my life, but it was also, looking back, very interesting, though I would not choose to repeat the experience. To this day, I don't know what was in the weed, though it should be noted that Noel smoked some of the same batch the following week and had some similar, though much less intense effects. It feels good to get this down in writing, even if it is a little stressful. It certainly changed my perception of the world and taught me something about how limited the sober mind can be. I cannot smoke weed now, as it causes me intense anxiety and depersonalization that can last for up to a week following the smoke. Make sure your weed is legit, boys and girls. The only trips I take now are through this channel. A Summer of Madness. This report is about my experience with Datura, Jimson weed, sacred Datura, whatever you want to call it. I was about 15 or 16 at the time. I am now 28. My weight was about 130 at the beginning, 120 at the end. School ended for the summer, and I ran out of my usual substances. So out of boredom, I harvested a few ounces of the root from the Arizona desert I live in. It grows literally everywhere. I dried the roots out and shredded them up with a cheese grater and began smoking them in the early part of summer break. I got a mild euphoria and hallucinations that I did not realize were not real. I would sleep all day and sneak out of my window at night. I don't remember a lot about the experience, as I was mostly delirious throughout the summer. I remember I was extremely sensitive to light because my eyes were extremely dilated. I would hide in the shadows and smoke all night. I remember thinking the moon was my only friend and looking up at its face and feeling comforted by it. I thought that when I was in the shadows, I was invisible. I felt like I was dead and had become a ghost. One time, I was sitting next to the soda machine at a nearby trailer park in the shadows, and a woman walked up to the soda machine I was sitting next to. She didn't even see me though. She was less than 3 feet away from me. I said, "Hello?" and scared the shit out of her. A different time, I dressed in dark clothing and painted my face black with shoe polish. That was a complete pain to wash off, and put a chain over my shoulders and snuck up to a fellow classmate's window at 3 a.m. Obviously, I didn't like him. I had huge dilated eyes, a mask, and everything, and knocked on his window. He came to the window and completely freaked out and screamed for his daddy. His dad came to the front door as I was walking away. He shined a light on me as I was walking away, and I kept walking. I walked about a half-mile away where I could still see his house, sat in the dark shadows, and watched the cops show up and talk to the horrified classmate. And after a while, I got bored and left. By the end of the summer, I was fried crispy, so to speak. My homie said when I got back to school that fall, "What the fuck happened to you? You're fried." I went back to using weed, pills, and Datura, and ended up in the psych ward not long after that for an overdose. I was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and I ended up dropping out of school for a while. But I went back and got my diploma later. I have never been the same since. Since then, I have tried a lot of drugs, but mostly now I just do shrooms once in a while. A word of advice: do not try Datura. It is poisonous. It will mess up your brain in a very bad way, if you live through it at all. I was extremely lucky to survive, and to be able to tell about it at all. Stay away, stay alive. To this day, I'm still sensitive to light. I still have to take medication for schizophrenia, and probably always will. This wasn't 1P LSD, and these are some strange effects. This trip report is going to be about my 4th time diving into the wondrous land of what I thought was 1P LSD. This is my first trip report that I have written as well. I had placed an order for 1P LSD and just got it in. I was very excited as this was the first time in 7 months that I thought I had the chance to do good quality lab tested LSD. Because of my work, I only have weekends off, so I planned this trip and introduction back into psychs for a queer Saturday morning. I planned on going to a local park in the river valley and to simply sit in nature and experience what I needed to alone. This was going to be my first solo LSD experience. I got up that Saturday morning, packed all the things I would need, and headed off on my bike at 9:45 a.m., anticipating what was to come. There was a large hill down into the valley, and at the top I stopped and dosed, knowing it would be 15 to 20 minutes before I found a spot to hang out that was secluded, so I might as well get the Lucy in my system. At 10:03 a.m., I placed the tab under my tongue, started my timer, and prepared myself for what I thought would be a truly amazing experience. As I cruised down the hill, any anxiety I had left about dropping was gone, and I found myself looking forward to learning and experiencing new things. I biked into the park and quickly found a very chill spot on the raised bank of the river. It was just a small grassy clearing and some thick bushes where I laid my bike down and put my backpack and jacket down to sit on. I had a great view from about 20 feet above the river because the bank was raised. I could see a footbridge fairly close and the bank on the other side. I laid down, looked at my timer, and seen it had been 8 minutes since I dosed, and simply just laid there. This is where the story changes. I was under the impression, obviously, that I had taken 1P LSD, and so I was eagerly waiting for the first physical effects to show. For me, this includes the electrical energy and buzz that makes its way up my legs and the headspace change as I start to sink into the trippy reality. This, however, did not ever happen. I was about 45 minutes into the come-up when I really started to question what I had taken. I can usually feel LSD in 20 to 30 minutes. I just thought it was taking longer than normal and put on my headphones, laid back, and looked up at the sky. However, I hadn't eaten all day, so it would make sense for the LSD to hit me fast. I was looking into thick gray clouds and trying to see if I noticed any changes in my vision, and then I started seeing small purple dots appear all over my vision. Maybe once or twice a second, a couple would appear and then disappear. That was all I felt or saw until about an hour and 15 minutes in, when I decided to start smoking some of my distillate. I got a little baked and just kept listening to music and looking at the sky. I had a very small muscle tense kind of buzz that was barely noticeable from about an hour 15 in until about 2.5 hours, when I started to really feel the effects of this terribly odd substance I had taken. I had just stopped a song and decided to take my headphones off to see if I could notice any more changes. I sat up and noticed a little bit of disconnection from my body and this reality. It was very slight, almost a dissociation feeling with a trippy feeling, and then also just a what the fuck feeling with still no visuals. I found taking off my headphones was not nice because of how loud nature was, and put them back on without any music playing. Because they were noise cancelling, all I heard was a very slight monotone frequency in my ears, and this tripped me the fuck out. I was staring straight at the ground with just my body and arms slightly in my view, and as I got deeper and deeper into this frequency, the feeling of dissociation really increased. It caused my brain to process this reality as I guess fake because there was no sound with it. My arm looked extremely odd, no hallucinations, just a perspective change. Then the full effect came on. My entire vision seemed to be affected in a way I have never experienced. The corners of my peripheral vision seemed to stretch outwards, pulling what I was seeing with it, so my body started to distort and pull quite significantly if I stared hard enough. This feeling and visual I struggle hard to describe because it falls in a completely new line of effects I have never experienced from anything or heard of. It was almost as if you took a screenshot of your vision, put it on a computer, and used a program to just stretch the corners of that photo. Everything in my vision was intact and normal. just my whole setting seemed to be all one piece and seemed to be magnified slightly. This wasn't pleasant, however. In fact, it was alarming at first because it was quite intense. I would just get sucked into this stretching reality. It had a very evil and creepy, trippy feeling associated with it, so I thought I should get up and move and bike around. I stood up, and immediately my balance was a bit off, and I was almost overly aware that I was a brain controlling my body, or a consciousness controlling a machine, or that's how it felt like. I put my stuff away, hopped on my bike, and started riding up a gravel path to the footbridge. This is when things started to get too intense. Riding my bike with my hands just in the bottom of my vision and the trail ahead, reality started to fall apart. The same vision, stretching, started to happen, except this time I lost almost all of my depth perception. It seemed that no matter the object, it as well as the background and everything in my vision was all mushed together into one flat plane, yet I was still riding forward through it. It was like viewing a two-dimensional world while actually still being in a three-dimensional one. My hands on my handlebars began to stretch and warp towards me like it was coming towards the part of my brain processing vision, and it felt like my vision was widening at the bottom, and the world that I was seeing began to look like it was warping and stretching around me, and it felt as though I was so much more immersed in the world because objects would stretch and move closer and farther away in my vision. All of these effects, and seemingly no regular hallucinations, no tracers, no patterns, no deep sense of a psychedelic experience. It was always my entire vision distorting, and just the feeling that was associated with how lost I was with what was happening. So I ride up onto this footbridge and over a river. Bad idea. Lots of people on it as I went over. Basically, my vision becomes entirely like what I've described, and so riding across the bridge, I had the railing stretching and pulling past me, and with my vision just so fucked up, I could almost not tell what I was looking at. I began to feel that this was very wrong. The reality I was now in felt so familiar but so distant at the same time. I felt almost as if everything I was viewing was an overlaid fabric of people and trees and everything normal, but there was nothing underneath. Nothing I saw had substance or a story or a place. It was just there, and I was simply living through it. I didn't take much notice of the people around me, and every second riding forward, it felt like I wasn't really going anywhere because my vision would stretch the ground out, and then I would just skip forward in time and be farther along the trail. My mental state at this time was very challenging. It felt as though I had become so dumbed down that I could barely keep one thought, and that thought was stopped by this wall every time, so I was extremely disoriented and lost with what I was doing. On the other side of the bridge, I kept biking down the trails with my head down, hoping no one noticed how fucked up I was. I knew if I found a safe place, I could wait out the effects. I was riding through the forest, and the trees and trail all stretched and warped in, my vision feeling like I was encased and immersed and stuck. I stood for a second in the middle of the trail and had a completely blank mind. I didn't know where I was, what I was doing, or why I was in this fucked up reality. The visual intensity of simply looking at things was overwhelming. I got to the edge of the river and sat on some rocks and looked out over the river. My depth perception was almost entirely gone. The clouds, far trees on the hill, the bridge that was close, the riverbank, water, and the rocks I was sitting on all looked like they were on one wall, maybe 20 feet away in perfect detail, but all on the same page of reality. It was not pleasant at all. Absolutely so weird to actually see, and then my vision was stretching again, which kept giving me this deep, unsettling something is wrong feeling. I decided the best thing to do was to go home and hope I could just lay down and let it wear off, because being outside with so much to look at was almost unbearable. There was no escape from the visual distortions, as everything I looked at became my reality. Closing my eyes would just place me in a black void of nothing with no thoughts, no direction, just plain nothing. I biked back the way I came and over the bridge again. My thoughts consisted of me thinking that I was not in this reality, but whatever reality I was in, I was just going to play the game and continue with what felt right. It almost felt like playing a simulation where my brain was uploaded into my body and I could simply make decisions. Extremely, extremely odd. I will now add also, this did not feel like a high. It felt like something I wanted to end and something I should have not seen or experienced, similar to wanting DPH to end. It was almost not a trip. At the same time, it was just this stuck mental capacity and horrible headspace and visuals. I got to a bench very close to the wedge of the park and sat down for a second to think and regain what was happening. I drank a bunch of water and looked out over this open field with trees far away, and the same thing. The trees that were maybe a kilometer away and the road maybe 300 meters away all seemed to me to be the same distance away. I tried to think about anything, and my thoughts started to become not my own thoughts, and I started to lose control, which scared me. I got up and biked home somehow, having my vision just so out of whack, and went to my room where I lay a couple of hours. I thought it had mostly worn off because my vision for the most part had regained depth and I began to be able to think better, but as I went upstairs for dinner, I was still tripping pretty hard. My pupils were massive and my eyes were red from smoking throughout the day, not really sure how no one in my family noticed. I then had a headache that night and woke up the next day feeling better, but worried about lasting mental effects. After my last real experience with 1P, I had a very intense ego death and didn't touch psychs for 2 months after that, simply learning from the experience. Then I tried some of the same acid that I used for that experience and it didn't work. It was more of a slight stimulant and that's it. I ate 5 or so of those tabs, seeing if any of them would work, but none did. Usually just a long come up to a not very intense speed-like feeling, and when I took 2 of them, I tripped a little, but definitely not acid, just very slight pastel visuals. Then I got some acid 2 months after that, and it was supposed to be amazing, and I took it, and once again, did not trip, but had a very similar experience to this, just with the visuals and headspace being a little different. Not tripping or high, really just on something. Could it be possible to have affected my brain so much with an ego-death experience that LSD cannot bind to my serotonin anymore? I have smoked dabs and oil for almost a year straight now, but don't know if that would have any effect. If anyone has some sort of ideas for what could be happening, is what I would love to hear. The only other substances used since the first time I took LSD is DXM, maybe 4 times, and just weed, so I have nothing else affecting my brain very much. Just very curious as to why many tabs I have tried led to similar results. Could just be bad tabs. Last thing I expected. At one point in my life, I was in Poland for half a year, hoping my parents could cut my supply of drugs by sending me across the ocean to live with my father. I can't remember what happened most of the time, but one night stands out the most. I get a call on Messenger from one of my friends I met at a gas station nearby. He invited me to a house overnight that we could chill at. I walked a good 60 minutes there and was greeted by him. There was me, my friend we will call M, and 2 other people that I'll call S and C. The house was owned by the parents of C's girlfriend, who was left in charge of taking care of the house while they were away in the countryside for 1 week. We began to chat, and I'm served some whiskey mixed with Coca-Cola and got pretty tipsy. During the conversation, I thank S for the speed he provided me a week ago, and C picks up on what I said. He tells me, "Come inside and look." I oblige and see a line of powder. He tells me to rail it, and I oblige, which it felt very like Adderall. We plan on doing more of whatever the substance was, and for that, we needed to weigh it out. C goes to another house to get a scale, returns, and we enter the kitchen. I ask M what drug it is, and he said it's similar to speed, but not speed. S then pulls out a 40-pack cigarette box, and when he opens it, it's some very beautiful, gold-tinted crystal meth. We weigh out 0.4 grams and we make lines from them. I pick the one I think is the biggest and rail it. And when that shit touched my nostrils, it fucking burned. And when I say fucking burned, I mean it fucking burned. I began to tear up. The burning subsided within a minute or so, and then it hit me. I felt very clear-headed and stopped fidgeting as much. I have ADHD. Breathing felt way easier, and moving seemed to be effortless. I felt like I can complete anything. We kept on talking to each other until sunrise, getting more tipsy, snorting more lines, smoking more cigarettes. I eventually consumed about 4 lines of meth, which I'd estimate to be 200 milligrams in total. The sun eventually rises at about 4:30 a.m., and I thanked them all for the meth and was given an extra cigarette on my way home. I felt euphoric and alive on my way home and greeted people I didn't know at all. I get back home and masturbate for 8 hours straight while struggling with ED. Holy fuck. Just stroking it sent pleasurable pins and needles down my body, and it was fucking amazing. Sometime during the session, I begin to see my wall somewhat formed faces staring at me, and I fall into a trance-like state and just jerk off while imagining the weirdest stuff for several hours. At one point, I thought I had 3 penises and that they were joystick controllers for women to play some sort of video game that controlled the emotions of a man. Eventually, I give up and head out at about 2 p.m. outside. My dad's worker informs him that I was up very early, complaining of stomach problems, and my dad comes to interrogate me. He notices I am shaking and that my pupils are dilated and asks if I am okay, which I say yeah. He proceeds to threaten me with beatings if I fuck with him again, and he punishes me by making me run around the property 30 times. I had no problem with that, knowing the stimulant will help me, so I begin. After completing lap 1, my dad calls me and says, "I need to make sure your blood pressure isn't too high for exercise." And when he does measure it, it read 180 over 120 and a pulse of 165, and it would barely drop. He tells me to get in the car and drives me to the hospital, and then we meet with a doctor. I try to play it off as too much caffeine, and the doc says I am lying because caffeine constricts pupils, which stunned me. I thought it was the opposite, but I don't even know now. They all ask me what I took, and if I don't confess, I will be sent for a blood analysis and those sort of things. And I'm not letting them find methamphetamine in my system, so I come up with some bullshit saying it was shrooms, and proceed to spew out more BS that I get away with. Go home with a prescription of hydroxyzine. It's not done yet. I'll write the next part another time. My personal experience with Latuda, a bipolar medication. Note: scary withdrawals. Do not listen if easily paranoid. Important things I wish I'd done to avoid this situation. Talk to your psychiatrist when you have problems with your medication. Taper off, especially when you're on a high dose. Research the medication you're on, and if possible, before you start taking it. This is basic stuff anyone should know when they start psychiatric treatment. I didn't. Don't make the same mistakes I did, and you should be fine. I haven't taken Latuda in years, so my explicit memories of it are a bit fuzzy, but I do remember a few weeks before spring break of 2018, I think it was in March because my brother's birthday was around that time, I got so frustrated with taking Latuda because every time I took it, I would vomit. The dose was too high for me, and I hadn't been diagnosed with my acid reflux yet, so I gave up on the medication and quit taking it cold turkey from what I remember to be a relatively high dose. Although I don't remember what the exact dose was. I had been told by my psychiatrist that it was the second highest dose anyone was allowed to take safely, and didn't tell my psychiatrist until about a week later. I was 19 and irresponsible, but I'm better about that kind of thing now. He prescribed a new medication, which I'm still taking now. I won't name it. I don't want to sound like I'm promoting anything, and besides, I'm probably going to have to switch again in a few months, because the new medication isn't as effective anymore. I started taking it the night before my family, my mom, my stepdad, my brother, and I left to go to San Diego for spring break. Everything was fine, aside from the mood swings that I would have due to the new medication not having started working yet, until about 2 or 3 days in. Heads up, this isn't meant to sound like a horror story, but it generally felt horrifying at the time. Again, there were a lot of factors adding into this. I quit cold turkey from a high dose, and apparently, Latuda is doubled as a schizophrenia medication, causing the severe, rare withdrawal symptoms to be similar to that of schizophrenia. Again, chances are you won't have the same experience as long as you taper off and keep in touch with your psychiatrist. One night, while we were staying in a small Airbnb, I woke up and saw a figure standing at the foot of my futon I was sleeping on. At first, I thought it was my brother trying to play a prank on me, because he was holding a pillow and grinning. But then something clicked, and I realized that the figure was too tall to be my brother. My next immediate thought, as the figure approached, was that someone had broken in through the window and was trying to suffocate me to death. I screamed for my life, and my stepdad ran out and turned the light on. As soon as the light turned on, the figure seemed to just float into the ceiling and disappear. My mom came out to console me as I couldn't stop crying, and I slept the rest of the night with the light on. The next morning, I did what I should have done beforehand and researched the medication. It wasn't until then that I found out that it was also used as a schizophrenia medication, and that hallucinations were a possible withdrawal symptom. The next few nights went oddly but less terrifying. For example, one night when we were staying at a different Airbnb, I thought I saw a giant bubble float into the room I was staying in with my mom and stepdad. And I told my mom, and she told me to shut up and go back to sleep. Thanks, Mom. She wasn't very supportive after that first incident. In fact, she was more mad at me than anything. My brother still hasn't forgiven me for ruining his birthday trip. None of my family seems to care that I'm still scared of the dark because of that one night. I thought I was fine a few weeks later, but I kept seeing things out of the corner of my eye. Sometimes I would fall asleep and I would hear laughing or crying or conversation. It was gibberish that I couldn't make sense of. Or sometimes I would hear a loud explosion or pop that would wake me up. Some nights, when driving home from my boyfriend's house, I would look in the rearview mirror and for a split second see figures in the back seats. Other times, while driving at night, I would think that there were people in the middle of the road, slam on my brakes, only to realize there was no one there. I almost caused accidents a few times, which became an issue eventually because when there were actually people on the road, the calls would be much closer, and needless to say, I never saw the same people jaywalking twice. Eventually, I just started choosing the drive home before sunset to avoid the issue. One night, I was playing board games with my roommates and their friends. I didn't have any IRL friends of my own, and I also have really bad social anxiety. And I thought I saw someone standing in the doorway of the room, but it wasn't even dark. All of the lights were on. I thought it was just one of my roommate's friends, until I did a quick head count and realized there was one too many. As soon as I came to that realization, I nearly had a heart attack, and then the figure disappeared. Apparently I went ghostly pale because everyone noticed. After a few minutes of them prying, I finally told them what had happened. I thought they were going to think I was crazy, but they were actually really supportive, and I thanked them for that. Thankfully, I haven't had any hallucinations since last year, so I think it's safe to say I've finally gotten past the Latuda withdrawal symptoms, although the paranoia is still there. Moral of the story: talk to your psychiatrist when you have problems with your medication.